Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello, everybody.
And this is my esteemed colleague Jaime Maraken,
And
scholar at Western Oregon University.
thank you. And I have the pleasure of having this conversation with Yasuo from the University of California, Santa Barbara.
And we're both cultural historians.
That's right, from China and Mexico.
So today we're going to talk about hope. So Jaime, what should we know about hope? What's important about it?
Well, to be honest with you, before this year, after receiving this question from Roland, and after listening to Pavlos Kontos talk about hope from an Aristotelian point of view, that changed my views about hope a little bit. Because before, I think my view of hope was something close to what the dictionary says that esperanza in Spanish is, which is a state of mind that arises when a desire presents itself as achievable. So I was surprised to learn from Dr. Kontos that Aristotle says that hope is actually an intellectual skill through which one anticipates the need for achieving a desired goal. So that got me thinking, and I started doing some Google research, and I noticed that hope in Greek comes from elpis, which supposedly means to anticipate, usually with pleasure. And so I noticed that despite Aristotle, for the Greeks, hope also was not only intellectual, but also involved emotion. And I kept looking for definitions of the word, and I realized that in the so-called West, the word hope does not actually come from Greek, but from Latin, from the Latin word spero, which is apparently also full of meanings, including to await, to anticipate, to fear, to be apprehensive, to assume, or to suppose. So all these meanings are full of potential, and they all seem to be related to a teleological quality of the word, no? Like hoping is related to the future for sure. And I kept going, and of course I eventually thought about hope as a Christian virtue. So to me it was interesting to realize that hope had become not an emotion, not a skill, but a virtue, a moral virtue. And lastly, last but not least, in English, hope apparently comes from a Germanic word, hopa, and means, according to the dictionary, a feeling of expectation and desire for a certain thing to happen. But it also had an archaic meaning of feeling of trust, which I think probably comes from Christianity. And lastly, when the humanist friars were Christianizing Mexico, they chose the word in Nahuatl, netemachilistli, which actually translates as to trust, as a way to speak about hope. So all these things made me think about what would be a personal definition for hope. And today, after all this thinking, I will define hope to me as a verb, as the act of thinking and feeling for the future, mostly in a positive way, but also in a fearful manner. So that will be the personal definition of hope today. What about you, Ja?
Thank you very much. That's really a rich history to know. But unfortunately, from where I came from, the idea of hope or the words that represent this meaning rarely gets systematically philosophized. So that's the surprising part, and I wanted to share with all of you, because that surprised me when I just started thinking about this. And I look at all the Chinese terms, the classical Chinese terms that could possibly stand up for the meaning hope, and I realized that it was never really considered as philosophically profound. The only exception I can think of is Buddhism, but Buddhists talk about hope systematically, but unfortunately also from a position of disapproval. So think about the two important components in the definition of hope you just discussed. One is an orientation towards the future, right? And the other is a desire. And Buddhists have qualms about both parts. for one, if one focuses too much on the future, that distracts her attention away from the present. And that has often been regarded as a source of suffering. And desire unfortunately is a troublemaker for pretty much every serious thinker in Chinese thought, including the Buddhists, but not limited to them. For one, a desire creates attachments, and the desire creates unhealthy and unnecessary self-centeredness, and both of which are major source of suffering again. So that's part of the reason why hope doesn't really take off as a philosophical project. And another negative thing I'm going to say is that it's kind of boring. This is a little bit of my personal opinion. Because think of the definition again. It is a state of mind rises in which a desire presents itself as being achievable, right? In other words, hope is a desire for a specific goal as achievable and knowable. So it's a highly teleological line of thinking hinged on a very specific goal. So in that sense, in a more hopeful and more ideal vision of thinking of hope, I would think of hope as some vision of embracing the rich possibilities of the future. But if you think about the teleological model, it's actually more about foreclosing, narrowing down, rather than opening up.
Yes, that's food for thought. I would think that you are right in the sense that perhaps philosophically it's hard to sustain any of these meanings about hope that I was just going over through Google. But I will argue that hope is actually a very natural thing for us to feel and to think. So perhaps we don't need it to be philosophical to be true that we're always fearful and we're always strategically thinking about the future regardless the culture that we come from. I would think that's just a natural human thing to do, in my opinion. And I think that this is true based on the work that I do, which has to do with the colonial history of Mexico in general. One of the arguments that I am putting forward in my research is that the history of natural science and even social science is best understood, in my opinion, as a history of translations of local knowledges all over the world. And to understand like these amazing processes of translating knowledge, I think that every person involved was hopeful about something that they wanted to achieve. So if you had knowledge about the medicinal qualities of a plant and you were an indigenous person in Mexico, definitely you had hope for certain reward for your knowledge, for example, or perhaps you were hopeful about keeping that knowledge away from the colonizer. If you were a Spanish authority at the time, you probably were hopeful about that same knowledge from that plant could translate into profit. So I would argue that hope is perhaps philosophically untreatable in a way, but that if we as historians are trying to understand the major things that happen through history, you do not only need to study the deeds, but you also need to understand the motivations of these historical actors. And I think understanding their hopes is crucial for our understanding of history, because as you might remind, the good old Herodotus said that he wanted to start writing historias to preserve the deeds of the Greeks and the barbarians. And I think that we would be wise to follow that advice, and I would include the study of hope in that category. So What would you say about that? Yeah.
Oh, I really love the point about motivation because, for one, I'm not saying that everybody should just give up on hope. A critique is what we do. A critique of a concept really is to discern and take apart the system that it stands for, and then identify the better and more useful parts versus the less useful part.
I
Right.
agree.
So the part on motivation is the part I really love and I feel hopeful about. Is this flow of energy, is the momentum that propels people to close the gap between what is and what ought to be, right? So this is what we call the qi in Chinese philosophy, and it's this energy that propels us to push a gestalt shift, to see things in a hopeful way. So that is the part, is the heat, it's the energy that I really like. So I appreciate that point you made, and I also love that how you juxtapose hope with fear, because when it's a simplified way of thinking about things is that there are certain desirable things and there are other things which are less desirable, and in this case hope is uplifting, it's vibrant, it's positive, versus fear. I don't know if we want fear as much as hope, right? But you're so right. Both hope and fear are ingredients of appearance that one individual could possess at a certain historical moment, and we don't want to take that. We don't want to alienate them from one another and take away that depth. And for me, because I've been spending the whole year at Stanford writing about crying and tears, lacrimation, in medieval China, and the one concept that I constantly think of is vulnerability. And here I want to juxtapose vulnerability with hope, in the sense that I actually see vulnerability as a genuine form of opening up, of embracing potentialities and possibilities. Because the vulnerable mind actually is less capable of predicting, is less sure about themselves, and is thus more capacious of embracing the rich possibilities that may involve other people. So here, I'm agreeing with you there.
I knew that you were hopeful deep inside.
Would you like to share the one hope that you have at this moment you most want to share with us?
Yes, I guess all this year I have been operating with the hope of publishing the work I've been doing right now, and also thanks to being part of this conversation, I really think, I hope that works like yours and works like mine contribute to the preservation and actualization, to put it in Aristotelian terms, of what I consider to be our shared learned tradition.
Oh, thank you. That's so sweet.
And what about you? What is your hope for today?
Tengo la esperanza de hablar español pronto.
How?